All right, this will be a response to Jeff Holliday's videos that are entitled The Problem with Race Realism, Parts 1 and 2. Now, before beginning, I would like to invite Jeff Holliday to have a live discussion about race realism. And it can be as structured or as unstructured as he wants. I'd be happy to give him everything that I have, before going in. I'm not interested in, springing a trap on him or winning like the debate points or whatever. But I am interested in persuading him. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go through his videos here chronologically because they're kind of all over the place. Instead, I'm just going to go through them thematically. So first, academic consensus. One of the points in the video he brought up a lot is academic consensus, and I think he uses the term scientific consensus, and the scientific community doesn't think these things, and which it's kind of weird for him to just sort of say that, because as it happens, we actually have surveys of the majority views of intelligence researchers. And the median intelligence researcher, asked anonymously, of course, will say that about 50% of the black-white IQ gap is down to a genetic difference. That is, it's 0.5 heritable. We'll talk about what that means later. And this was true in 1984, and it was true in 2013, which were the 2 years that the survey was done. So it doesn't seem like there's a trend in either direction. In fact, there are other evidences to show, if anything, the trend is probably toward what we're calling race realism and hereditarianism, and that, race denial, as I call it, and race brain identicalism, as I call it, kind of pejoratively, or whatever you want to call it, it probably peaked in the mid-1990s. So if we're going to appeal to academic consensus on the heritability of racial IQ gaps, the starting point should be about 50%. If you want to sort of use the consensus as sort of a touchstone. Now, I personally think it's about 80%. So I'm higher on this scale. I'm a bit out of the consensus, a little bit, but I'm certainly not alone, and I'm not radical. I'm not radically out of it. And there are some people who say 100%, as you can see. And you may think that's crazy, but they're not saying quite what you might think they're saying. And maybe in the future, if we have our little discussion, I can kind of explain what exactly they mean by 100% of the variation is down to genetic variation, because it's not the same as what you would mean if you said that. Okay, but I don't want to get into that here. Also, it's worth pointing out that what surveys of experts say and what your textbook says are not exactly the same thing. And if I recall correctly, that textbook that you had and you showed in that video, I think has 20 pages on intelligence. And you'll notice that it's actually not terrible overall, how they describe intelligence, and certainly how they describe G. But it deviates from expert consensus once they start talking about heritability. Okay, the second thing that I want to bring up that he talked about is the Henry Goddard thing and the 1924 Immigration Act. Now, I think it's a great myth that Henry Goddard's test influenced the 1924 Immigration Act. And there's an excellent paper, in my opinion, that I think lays this to rest. And it's entitled Intelligence Tests and the Immigration Act of 1924. And there are some rather important passages, and I'll just quote some passages from this paper. First one, he says, Goddard, said explicitly that his study makes no attempts to determine the percentage of feeble-minded among immigrants in the general or even the special groups named, the Jews, Hungarians, Italians, and Russians. And the paper quotes Goddard himself. So I'm quoting the paper, but the paper is quoting Goddard himself saying right here. So this is basically Goddard speaking, saying, quote, assuming for the sake of argument that the percentages and mental levels shown in the foregoing results are approximately correct, what is to be done about it? Shall we say that they are feeble-minded, and we want no feeble-minded persons in the country, at least no more than we can produce ourselves. That is undoubtedly our first thought, but let us look at the matter broadly. ... We may argue that it is far more probable that their condition is due to environment than it is due to heredity. To mention only two considerations. First, we know their environment has been poor. It seems able to account for the result. Second, this kind of immigration has been going on for 20 years. If the condition were due to hereditary feeble-mindedness, we should properly expect a noticeable increase in the proportion of the feeble-minded of foreign ancestry. This is not the case." Close quote. And these are Goddard's own words. So please, okay, this is going to sound kind of harsh, but please stop parroting slander. Okay. And I'll just say that if I had put up that video that you put up, Jeff Holiday, saying what you said about Goddard, I would take it down. Okay, that's just what I would do. Now, remember, this line about Goddard, right, this whole sort of meme about Goddard's IQ test pushing the 1924 Immigration Act, they came from Stephen Jay Gould, who in 2011 was found to have falsified Samuel George Morton's skull measurements. And I'll have a link to the New York Times article that shows that Samuel George Morton correctly measured skulls of Asians and whites and stuff. And Gould's corrections that he had in his book, his corrections of Gould's measurements from the Mismeasure of Man, that his corrections were basically fraudulent, that Gould was committing academic fraud. And which is strange, given that Morton wasn't even making a claim about the cause of the skull size differences being innate or environmental. Right? He actually was agnostic on the issue. And remember, Gould was an open Marxist, and he was a founding member of an organization called Science for the People. So, maybe have a little bit of... I know I'm kind of poisoning the well a little bit about things that come from Gould, but Gould lies a lot. Gould is a serial liar about this stuff. Now, the paper that I'm talking about, it also goes into detail about just how much debate there was at the time in regards to the causes of IQ gaps among the intelligence community at the time. And it wasn't limited to Goddard's work. There was a tremendous amount of literature on the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests, for example. Let me put it this way. The concepts of, say, test bias or poverty or lack of education, these are not smart criticisms. Okay, these are criticisms that any 12-year-old can think of. If you sat him down and said, "What do you think that these differences in IQ are caused by?" He may say biology, but then he may say, "Oh, but it could be poverty, it could be education. You could have had bad parents." These are not these are not things that it was a great discovery to think up these possible objections, okay? And this is not to say that these criticisms are necessarily incorrect, but to imagine that the people from the post-World War I period didn't think of these things, it's really, it's just false, one. But it's just insulting, and it's kind of weird sort of projection onto these people that they don't have a mind, almost. Even forms of epigenetic arguments date back to the 1920s, and arguably some pseudo-epigenetic arguments existed all the way back to the Roman period. Another quote from the article. They said that, and they're talking about the passage of the Act itself. They say, quote, "We may begin with the Act itself, which in 32 sections makes no reference to intelligence tests, intelligence, feeble-mindedness, or any other related term. If the legislators cared about test results, they were careful to keep their concerns out of the legislation itself." In his book, Kamen, 1974, cites 3 such documents purporting to the influence of intelligence tests on the legislation. A letter from Arthur Sweeney on mental tests for immigrants, the report of the Committee of Selective Immigration of the Eugenics Committee of the United States of America, and a letter from the chair of the Allied Patriotic Societies of New York. In each case, the document was placed into the record with minimal introduction, and in no case could we find any mention of the documents or their contents anywhere else in the committee hearings or in the floor debates. Right? So that's pretty important, that none of these talks about intelligence tests made it to any floor debates, like the stuff that you see on C-SPAN today. Continue. Like most of the other addenda, this material seems to have entered the legislative record without leaving a detectable trace on the course of events. Of the total committee hearings and addenda for both House and Senate, then, allegations of innate intellectual inferiority of immigrants represented a minute fraction. The few reports presented or inserted into the record seem to have been largely ignored, and were not ignored, sharply criticized. The unimportance of the intelligence test data is epitomized by House Report number 350. The majority and minority reports from the House Committee on the Immigration and Naturalization to the full House. The majority report, written by Representative Johnson, emphasized the need, quote, to stand against the large number of aliens who enter the U.S., and, quote, to guarantee, as best we can at this date, racial homogeneity in the United States. The report teems with reasons for keeping inferior immigrants out of the country, but it contains no mention whatever to intelligence or intelligence testing. No mention either in the minority report, written by Representatives Adolph Sabath and Samuel Dickstein, who label the proposed act as racist and discriminatory, and who uphold the worth of the immigrant. Even when the innate characteristics of immigrants were the central issue, as in both of these reports, neither intelligence nor intelligence testing came up. Right? So, one, Henry Goddard believed that these differences between these ethnic groups, their scores on the IQ test, he believed that they were down to environment, first off. I mean, it wasn't very sophisticated at the research at the time, but he didn't believe they were down to genetics. The intelligence community itself was divided over it, and there was no mention of intelligence testing on the floor debates in any of this, and there was no mention of intelligence testing in any of the ultimately proposed legislation or in the final reports from both sides. So, it wasn't anywhere. So, hopefully, that lays to rest the myth of intelligence testing influencing the 1924 Immigration Act, or the myth that intelligence testing community was even unified on whether the different scores meant or what policy conclusions should be drawn from them. Okay, heritability. One concept that I think Jeff Holiday had some trouble with is heritability. And this is not a trivial thing at all. And I think his misunderstanding of heritability causes him to misunderstand twin studies and causes him to misunderstand the relevance of global data. In particular, he mentioned, the IQ of Libya. Now, heritability is the proportion of variance in an observable trait that is caused by genetic variance or variation. This is not the same as saying genes are X% responsible for the trait. Okay, those are two different statements. Let me explain it this way. Imagine a cow. Okay, there it is, a cow. Now, what percentage of that cow's traits are genetic, and what percentage of that cow's traits are environmental? Right? It's a nonsense question. There's no answer. There's no answer to that. That's not a question you can answer. Okay, don't try to answer it. A cow is just genes expressed in an environment. All organisms are genes expressed in an environment. Right? If you really want to break it down, it's basically us organisms are simply shells around DNA. And it's really the DNA that them trying to replicate themselves that create these increasingly elaborate shells around them, creating these what we call organisms anyway, I don't want to get into that. But it's those genes expressed in a certain environment. If you were to take some DNA and shoot it off into outer space, it wouldn't create anything, except maybe a little bit of a mess for somewhere. But if we get two cows, let's say we have two cows now, we can look at some differences between them. Let's say overall weight. And we can, by various methods, try to figure out if the difference in weight between the two cows is a product of, of a genetic difference between the two cows or an environmental difference between the two cows. Maybe they eat different grass, they have different feed, maybe the weather's different. Maybe Farmer Bob sings lullabies to one and doesn't sing to another, right? So maybe there's some environmental factors, or maybe it's a mixture of environmental and genetic differences that are causing the differences in weight. Okay, so we're talking about variation. What proportion of the variation can be explained by genetic differences, and what proportion of the variation can be explained by environment differences, right? We're not talking about what percent of a trait is genetic. That's nonsensical. Right. We're talking about variation. What proportion of variation in a given trait, like height, weight, IQ, what proportion of that is due to genetic variation? That's what heritability means. Okay. Now, misunderstanding this causes Jeff Holiday to not understand what general heritability estimates are. When a professional says that they think the heritability of IQ is 50% within the United States, okay, they're talking about within the United States, right? They're talking about this environmental range. They're saying that within the United States, 50% of all variation in IQ scores is down to genetic variation. And 50% of all variation in IQ scores is down to environmental variation, okay? So when they say this, they're not saying anything about Libya, okay? Now, you can agree or disagree. You say, no, I don't think it's 50% down to genetics. I think it's only 10%. And we can have a long conversation about that. But before we can even talk about any of that, you need to understand what they're actually saying. And right now, Jeff Holiday doesn't understand what they're actually saying because he doesn't know what heritability means. Okay. And let me put it like this. It seems really stupid for somebody to say that they think that, IQ is 80% genetic when a country like Qatar has an average IQ of 78. Okay, that seems like a really stupid thing for somebody to say. Really obviously stupid thing for somebody to say. Or to say that I think IQ is 80%, or forget 80%. Let's say they think IQ is 50% genetic when a country like Libya has an average IQ of 82, right? When we know that, Middle Eastern type people, when they're born and raised in the United States, they have IQs around, 93, 94. So it seems really stupid to say that IQ is 80% genetic when Libya has an IQ of 82. Obviously, there's profound environmental effects going on in Libya, so it's really stupid to say IQ, just a global statement, IQ is 82% genetic, right? So it seems really stupid and really obviously stupid. So obviously stupid that Jeff Holiday, somebody who has only recently started researching this, I don't know exactly how long, but he conveyed the impression in his video that he only started, maybe he's only spent like a week reading about race realism, that he was able to see how stupid this is. And given that, it should give you a little bit of pause, right? When it seems like somebody's saying something so fantastically stupid, maybe consider that they're not actually saying that, right? Because they're not actually saying that. And you're thinking that they were saying that stems from you not knowing what heritability means. We're talking about the proportion of variance in a trait that is a function of genetic variation, and whenever you talk about, you have to specify where and when. But in the United States, in France, in Germany, or if you want to get more specific, in Paris, in, you know, in Omaha. So, but now I'm going to sort of diverge a little bit regarding the global data. One line that has always stuck for me, and I don't quite remember where I heard it from, but there's this one line that always stuck with me, and it goes, "Observations come first." Now that doesn't seem like a very profound statement. It seems pretty obvious and kind of pedantic, but it's really quite important, and we can avoid a lot of problems if we took these lines to heart. Okay, see, like when Richard Lynn releases something and he says that Libya has an average IQ of 82. I don't recall exactly what it was, but when Richard Lynn says Libya has an average IQ of 82, and it's based on these tests, and you can go look up the tests, thanks Sci-Hub, or he uses things that are proxies for our IQ. Okay, that's that. It is observed. According to these metrics, we would say Libya has an average IQ of 82 compared to the United Kingdom score of 99 or something. So there we go. That's that. There's no need to rapidly come to some sort of conclusion from that. There's no need to start developing, opinions as to why that is. That data point is there, and it doesn't need to be explained. All right, standard deviations. Jeff Holiday appears to not have known what a standard deviation is based on his, he used the term deviation IQ, and saying that standard deviations have something to do with the IQ test kicking its own ass. And the thing is, he brings up standard deviation as if it's something that specifically has to do with race realism and IQ. And so I don't know quite exactly what's going on with that. He doesn't really say. So, okay, I'll just explain what a standard deviation is, okay? And it's this. There's a little image on the screen if you're just listening, but there's an image on the screen basically showing a bell curve with slices of standard deviations. And it's used as a measure of the distribution of data. Now, regarding IQ scores for whites, the average is 100 by construction, okay? Whatever raw scores white people get in a certain area, that's set to 100. I mean, if these IQ tests were being invented today, obviously they would never do such a thing like this. This is kind of a holdover from the old racial eugenics history of these tests. But anyway, average score is for whites is 100 by construction, and one standard deviation to the left is 15 points lower, or 85, and one standard deviation to the right is 15 points higher, or 115. Now let's say the standard deviation wasn't 15 but 20, right? And so there's a picture of that there. So a large standard deviation means a lot more variation in scores. That's what a standard deviation means. So when people say, I think incorrectly, East Asians have a narrower standard deviation, what they're saying is that East Asians have less fluctuation in IQ scores. I think that's incorrect, but that would be an example of people using the term standard deviation. Well, one thing people say is that the standard deviation for black IQ is around 13, not 15. What this means is that, in practice, it means that there's that blacks are actually in a narrower band of IQ ranges than whites are, and what this actually means functionally is that there's going to be fewer people. Even with a mean IQ of 85, there's going to be fewer black people with an IQ of 120 or higher than you would expect from their average IQ, because their standard deviation is less. It's not 15, it's 13, right? So it actually doesn't. So their bell curve doesn't go out as far to the right or the left, as they have fewer Nobels, but also fewer dumbbells than you would expect. That's caused by their smaller standard deviation. So that's what a standard deviation means. Just thought I would clear that up here. Okay, one thing Jeff Holiday talks a lot about is societal value. Well, we know that IQ is positively correlated with education level. It's correlated with various measures of job performance. In fact, IQ is a better predictor of job performance than education level. Um, there's they have to operationalize job performance somehow, right? They can't just stick a barometer in somebody and say, "Oh, your job performance is." They obviously have to come up with a way to measure job performance. But that aside, you know, by however they operationalize it, obviously, IQ is a better predictor of this job performance than education level. IQ is positively correlated with income. It's with staying married. That is not having divorces. It's not having children out of wedlock. It's negatively correlated with crime. People with higher IQs commit fewer crimes. Obviously, it's positively correlated with inventing things that other people like. The people who make advancements in computing and medical technology will have well above average IQs. So that's that. And what Jeff Holiday does is he asks some weird questions. Like he asks these rhetorical questions if one's, you know, societal value is determined by their IQ. And that's like a really weird thing that's kind of hard to respond to. And it's something that Jeff Holiday does a bit. It's not so much that what he's saying or even asking is like it's really hard to answer because it's not clear what he means by societal value. If he means in terms of things that people actually value, like inventing things and not committing crimes, well, IQ is strongly correlated with things that society values, okay? But if he means societal value in terms of some philosophical sense, well then, bleh. Okay, my answer to that is bleh because that's not a real thing. Okay, when you're talking about you're basically trying to bridge the Izot gap, and I never want to go to Izot, the land of Izot again. That's not a happy place. So that's just not interesting, and we can't. It's not something you can really have a meaningful discussion about. Look, IQ is correlated with things that people generally consider good. Okay, IQ is correlated with these things. That's all. And that's all you need to say. There's precisely zero need to say anything more than that or to try to reify IQ itself into something of value. All right, the title of one of his 2 videos is Defining Intelligence. And the way I think of it is like there's a beast underground, and we're trying to figure out how big, how fast, and how strong this beast is. But we can't directly observe it or take it out of its underground cave. What we can do is stick things in the cave and see what the beast does. We can observe the beast's action. We can observe its action. And how quick we stick a wooden post down there and see how quickly it destroys the wooden post, for example. Or how quickly it can evade some little contraption that's scary and chases it around the cave, and we move it around and feel, oh, we touched the beast, And so you can do all these little things to sort of infer what the beast is like based on what it does. And maybe you can throw some weights down there and see how quickly and easily it pushes these weights out of the cave. Right, and of course, a lot of this will depend on how the beast is doing the day the testing is done, right, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of how I see, measuring intelligence. It's like the beast in the cave, and you can't directly observe it, but you can indirectly observe it through its action, and that's what these IQ tests really are. Now, Jeff Holiday actually explained G adequately, okay? That is the statistical factor that explains the intercorrelation of IQ subtest batteries. And, I was pleasantly surprised by his explanation of G. But the funny thing is he explained it, it's weird, because he explained it fairly well, but then he seems to not have fully grasped what it meant. And then later on, he asks if intelligence to him is some singular thing or if it's a nebulous, multifaceted thing. And he says, it's obvious to me which one it is. And like, okay, well, it's obvious to you, but see, like, the whole point of G that you just illustrated is that to some extent, yes, intelligence is a singular thing, a single factor. Right? That's the point. There's like a big, long, ongoing debate about this. Right? Arthur Jensen was the prime mover of that position of a single general intelligence factor. And there were lots of arguments and lots of studies about this. This was a huge deal, right? And it's so weird. Like it would be one thing if he said, and this is what G is, and I don't believe it, right? And okay, but he didn't. He like explained G and did an okay job of explaining it, but then acts as if that explanation never occurred. So another thing he does is he misunderstands G and conflates it with innateness. Saying that Charles Spearman, I believe it was Charles Spearman, or maybe it was someone else, was held the position that there is an underlying genetic component to performance on tasks, but then there are these specific environmental things. And so he views this genetic component as a general intelligence factor, a genetic general intelligence factor, and then your specific abilities on any specific task, that's environmental. And that's incorrect. G does not mean genetic, it means general, right? It means the general intelligence factor, not the genetic intelligence factor. A G-loaded subtest simply means that subtest is a better predictor of how well you will do on other subtests, right? It's not the same as heritability, right? That's why we use different words for them. Okay, he then talks about neural branching. And basically what he says is that as you use your brain, the neural connections get more complex and the neurons touch each other more. Basically neurons behave like neurons. And I'm going to be a little bit of a Debbie Downer here, okay? Like, the neurons of raccoons also work this way, right? The neurons in a raccoon's brain, they branch out in response to environmental stimuli. So could a raccoon learn how to read and write and do calculus, if you give him enough education and training? No, obviously not. Even though the raccoon's neurons neurally branch, there is some limit to what a raccoon can do. So, like, there's some limit. But are we to assume that if you are a human, that your intellectual capacity can be infinitely expanded through just doing a bunch of intellectual stuff because, basically because neurons? I mean, Jeff wasn't exactly clear on what he meant by that, right? I mean, it's weird. It's like, yeah, we always knew that the brain responds to stimuli in some physical way because the brain is a physical organ. So what point he's trying to make by mentioning neural branching is not exactly clear. And he poo-poos the comparison between the brain and muscles with a vague assertion that the way the brain develops is somehow more profound than the way muscles develop. Right, but of course, what he's doing is he's trying to preempt this, is that I could explain how muscle fibers develop in response to environmental stimuli, like with a little diagram, right? And, I could say, look, genes don't matter. Here's how muscles develop in response to lifting weights. But that's obviously, like, a stupid argument because everyone sort of, like, knows experientially that genes matter a lot, that genetic variation explains a lot of your variation in physical strength, both initially and in terms of your long-term ability to gain muscle as well. That there's not only are there differences in what we'll call how much muscle mass you have and how strong you are in an untrained state, but also genetic variation explains a lot in terms of your ability to gain muscle mass and your ability to gain strength as well. So, like, if you apply that analogy to the brain, that leads to, fairly hereditary conclusions, to the extent that muscle development, there's genetic influences to muscle development. But anyway, so, and then here's another thing I could do. Like, I could say, look, the differences between humans and chimpanzees can't be down to genetics, because this is how neural networks in the brains of both humans and chimpanzees develop. Look, both human neurons and chimpanzee neurons neural branch, right? Like, it explains too much. Like, pointing, like, here's how neurons work, therefore infinite potential. Like, okay, well, here's how muscles work, therefore infinite potential. Oh, here's how, like, a rat's brain neurons work, therefore, stick with it, and this rat can become the cognitive equivalent of a human, right? I mean, it's like, no. So if he's trying to say that neural branching means genes don't matter, that's obviously silly. But the hell of it is, like, I'm not even sure if that's even what he was saying. Okay, and again, this is kind of so annoying about this, because he makes these statements that it's like, how do I respond to that? Because I'm not exactly sure what he's even saying. And what he's saying is not even necessarily like a concrete statement that you can say, yes, that's true, or no, that's incorrect. And what I think he does is he says things that are, he tries to, like, imply things that are wrong without explicitly saying them, hoping that the audience will believe it, right? Like, infinite mental development because neurons work in a way. But he doesn't say that explicitly, because then he could be called out on it. And, like, lastly, something about intelligence. Your score on an IQ test reasonably accords with how smart other people perceive of you in a discussion group, and the longer you are around a person, the stronger the correlation between IQ and perceived intelligence is. Early on, perceived intelligence has a lot to do with how much of a loudmouth you are, but over time, the correlation is stronger with IQ and less with, less with being a loudmouth. Now, you may say, and I put a little image up here for those just listening to the audio. Now, if you may say that a correlation of 0.37 is not terribly high, but remember, those are just discussion groups, and also what they mean by intelligence is not necessarily the same thing as what intelligence researchers mean by intelligence. Like, somebody could know a lot of stuff about the history of something, and likes to talk about the history of, like, the Russian Civil War or something, and it's like, oh, he's really smart because he knows a lot of factoids about the Russian Civil War. That's not the same as, IQ. But anyway, I suspect that if you had these groups of people around each other for, say, like a whole year, and they were working on all sorts of projects together. They weren't just having little discussion groups or whatever, but they were actually, like, working on projects and actually had to solve things. I suspect that the correlation between perceived intelligence and IQ would be a lot higher, that it would be well over 0.5. But that's, of course, just my suspicion on that. Okay. At one point, Jeff said something in a kind of offhand way that was actually really important. I don't think he quite grasps at this point just how important that is. But it's really important. He said that while, yes, evolution dictates that there are probably some differences in the brain between the races. You mean, don't want to call them races. I don't believe in race. Fine. The populations, the clusters, haplogroups, Klein, whatever. He says that, that there are probably some differences between the races. Now, he thinks that those differences are tiny, and then he says that the jury is still out in other places. Now, I think that that's incorrect. I think that this statement that the jury is still out, I understand that it's like, how do I put it? saying, like, I don't know is not always the most prudent answer. Like, I don't know is not necessarily the smart position to have. Like, sometimes you do know, and some people are trying to say, well, I don't know. I'm being more skeptical and I'm being more rigorous is just kind of a cloak for not wanting to accept obvious conclusions. Like the call for more and more rigor I think is often, and especially in regards to race and intelligence, is more of a way to sort of shield yourself from obvious conclusions. But anyway, I'm digressing. So he says that yes, these populations evolved in different parts of the planet, and so there's probably going to be some slight differences in cognitive traits. Call it intelligence or not, call it whatever, but there's probably going to be some differences, and he says that but these differences are going to be very small. Okay, that's fine. You say that they're very small for now. But this is important because he has essentially agreed to the racial hereditarian frame. That populations evolved in different places, call them races or whatever you want. Okay, they developed all sorts of differences, including brain size and shape. Yes, including brain size. Please, don't. Just no Gould. Please put down the Gould. This is true. Modern data confirms this. Okay, there's MRI data that confirms this. Okay, basically the old Victorian era scientific racialists were correct. Okay, they were. This is true. Put down the Gould. Put down the Gould. Okay, so just stop. Okay, so there's differences, all sorts of differences between these races, including differences in brain size and shape. So the idea that these races, or whatever you want to call them, would have on average precisely identical cognitive abilities. I call these cognitive traits intelligence or whatever you want to call them. That's basically impossible. There's no way that they could be precisely the same. Okay? And once you're there, right, basically, and once you recognize that, like, you're basically a race realist and it's just a matter of degree. Okay? At this point, I mean, it may seem sort of weird to think of it this way, but at this point, Jeff Holiday is like a race realist who, I mean, if you put a gun to his head, well, actually, I think if you put a gun to his head, he would say like 50%. But Jeff Holiday is basically a race realist with a very low heritability estimate. Okay, I mean, to think of it that way. Now, he would never call himself that, but functionally, that's what he is. He's a race realist who believes that perhaps environment accounts for 98% of all general variation and variation between the races in IQ, and maybe there's only 2% that's down to genetic variation. Okay, 2%, but he's still, basically he accepts the racial hereditarian frame, but only to 2%. I accept the racial hereditarian frame to 80%. Now, 80% and 2% is a pretty big difference, right? There's a difference between those numbers, obviously. But it's okay. But he's accepted the frame, and now it's just a matter of degree. Okay. And this is something that I've said for a long time, is that let's say you had somebody who was looking at like brain size data and said that, look, these Africans, they have smaller brains. And so what that means is that their neurons are more physically compacted together. That is, there is less space between the neurons. And so these neurons can work together much more efficiently, create more intricate connections. This then translates into more intricate thought. And so the African brain is actually going to be more complex and more sophisticated than the European brain because it's smaller. All right? Now, I don't think that's true. Right, I don't think that the data says otherwise, but somebody who says that, African brains are better because they're more compact and more efficient and allow for more neural complexity because of their compactness. Somebody who says that is in my book 10,000 times more sane, more credible than somebody who says, like, they're all the same. Like, the races all have precisely the same average, cognitive traits, right? Like the person who says that blacks, because of their smaller brains, are going to be basically smarter, right? At least, like, I think he's wrong. Like, somebody who said that would be wrong, but at least they're dealing in, at least they sort of have one ear in reality, and they're saying something that, like, could be true. Like they're like that. That's an improvement. They're that's incorrect. Like, that's wrong. That idea is incorrect. But it's at least It's at least truth apt. How do I put it this way? It's at least a proposition to where truth and falsehood actually applies. Whereas somebody who says they're all the same, well, that's not even, like, I mean, that would be like, that would be like randomly picking a grain of sand out of the beach and it being like that's what, and it being like one specific grain of sand and like all the beaches. Like, it's cosmically impossible that they would be the same. Like galactically, it's like a galactic impossibility that they would end up being precisely the same. So that's just a little bit of a side on that. But anyway, what I wanted to say here is Jeff Holiday is already a race realist, and it's just a matter of degree. All right, the next thing Jeff talks about is poverty and IQ. And it's not until late into the second video that Holiday starts making these sort of on-case arguments against racial hereditarianism. And he starts off with poverty. He points out that people who have lower IQs tend to be poor, right? Which is what you would expect. IQ is a proxy for intelligence, and the smarter people tend to earn more money. But of course, he believes that there is causation in the other direction, that it is the poverty itself causing the low IQ within the United States. Okay. So, well, one thing we can look at are several populations around the world which are poorer than African Americans, but whose mean IQ are significantly higher. Okay. And I'll have a little chart up here showing that. Now, you may want to chalk that up to other environmental factors. Okay, and maybe other environmental factors that perhaps correlate with poverty within the United States. Fine, but it's not money qua money, right? Clearly. In addition, we can look at blacks and whites at the same income brackets, and we can look at their SAT scores. Okay, and then we see that whites within every bracket score higher. In fact, whites at very low socioeconomic status, can start outperforming the blacks at the highest socioeconomic status. And we can also look at this in terms of IQ scores. Now, one tact with this is to show that heritability of IQ decreases as socioeconomic status decreases. That is, more of the variance in IQ is explained by environmental factors in poorer people. And if you want to talk about this, I can explain why this is not nearly as important as it might first seem. And it has to do with the increased heritability of IQ with age. And okay, you may imagine that environmental deprivations at younger ages is going to perhaps cause developmental problems. That's going to limit the upper potential for their adult IQ. But apparently not too much, since adult general heritability of IQ is as high as it is. But that's something that we can talk about if we have a live discussion. Okay, another thing he brought up, and he just sort of brought this up in passing, was poverty and crime. And he repeats that poverty is associated with crime. And this is true, but of course, so what? Traits that are associated with criminality, right? Aggression, stupidity, low self-control. Okay, you would expect people who are aggressive, stupid, and have low self-control to be poor and criminal, So, first of all, the association exists. And one thing that I would link to an article by Sean Last on our website, it's not as typological as you might expect. And according to several meta-analyses, only about half false studies find a statistically significant association between poverty and crime. What it shows is that the relation is so weak. It's so weak that half of the time it doesn't rise to statistical significance. In addition, we can see that both violent and property crime in the U.S. has increased as the poverty rate has gone down. Now, you may say that, well, as a country gets wealthier, there's more stuff to steal. And that's a fair point sort of at a theoretical level. But, what does this mean? Should African countries, they should have an exceptionally low property crime rate, right? African countries should have very low property crime because there's very little property to steal. But of course, we know that that's not true at all. In addition, we know that violent crime increased, as the poverty decreased in the United States. So violent crime and property crime seem to sort of follow the same trajectory. So an explanation for the rise in property crime, which has to do with more stuff to steal, it rings sort of like that would work, like if only property crime was rising, but since property crime and violent crime is rising, it doesn't seem like a credible explanation. And another thing, in terms of race, the black and Hispanic proportion of a state is a much stronger predictor of violent crime for that state than is the poverty rate, the unemployment rate, or the proportion that has completed high school. And this is a replicated finding. There are multiple studies in an article that I'm going to have in the description talking about that on race, poverty, and crime. And, yes, you will find a correlation between poverty and crime. But my guess is you'd find a stronger correlation between menthol sales and crime. Another thing that Jeff Holiday kind of alluded to, and he didn't go into a lot of detail on this, was stereotype threat. And on this, I would recommend a fantastic article that I wrote on stereotype threat. And there are 5 things, really, that seriously call into question stereotype threat. The first was a study done with women. Now, fair enough, this wasn't done with blacks or Hispanics or whatever. So it was done with women. But what they did is that the researchers put in gender primes as much as they possibly could on the test. Right? Say, are you a woman? In fact, there were even some. There was some way. I think there was a wave where they actually went in and before they gave the test, they said, on these kinds of tests, women do worse than men. Here's the test, right? Which is like the most overt sort of gender prime. And so like any stereotype threat research would say, yes, you're going to have a massive effect there. And so they did all this. But in one sample, they would pay the students for good scores. And on the other sample, they didn't pay for good scores. And the males and females had, of course, similar standardized tests coming into the experiment. So they knew what their scores were beforehand, so they could tell if they were underperforming or overperforming like their baseline, like their SATs coming into college. And in the payment condition, there was no stereotype threat effect at all. Like, men and women did the same, no matter how much the researchers tried to insinuate that women would do worse when they were paid for doing well. Okay. Now, of course, when they didn't pay the students anything, they found really big stereotype threat effects. Female scores were depressed. But if they said, we're going to pay you if you do well, the female scores went back up to what you would expect given their prior baseline. Like, no matter how much you told them that, you basically tried to insinuate that women are stupid. And this ties into a second problem with stereotype threat, which is how it doesn't actually show up in real world sort of natural experiments. It doesn't show up in real world conditions. There were 3 natural experiments of stereotype threat. One involving the NAEP, the National Association Educational Proficiency or whatever test, the AB Calculus test, and a community college computerized placement test that they had on a national level. And on these tests, it wasn't standardized whether or not they asked the students their gender and race. Some of them did, some of them didn't, and this is great. Because what it allowed is we have some tests that have a gender prime, as they call it, or a race prime, and some of them didn't. Okay, so we have sort of a natural experiment. Let's see what the effect was, and the effect was 0. Now, obviously, researchers can't go out and put gender primes and race primes on some real-world tests and not on other real-world tests, like real-world tests that's actually going to affect your ability to get into college, for example. They can't make a stereotype threat experiment out of that because it wouldn't pass ethics. But of course, the reason it wouldn't pass ethics is based on their presumption that there is such a thing as stereotype threat effect. But anyway. So natural experiments like real world tests where you have these stereotype threat primes showed no effect, and there's no effect when you pay them to do well. A third problem with stereotype threat is that even the laboratory experiments, which is all the evidence for stereotype threat are these laboratory experiments where students come in, and they're basically in the psychologist's fun house where they try to evoke a stereotype threat effect on a test that is not going to impact them, where there's no negative consequences if they do badly on this test. Okay, that's what stereotype threat. That's what it's all based on. It's based on these laboratory experiments, not like laboratory like a chem lab, but laboratory in that it's the environment that the researcher controls. But anyway, the problem, even with the laboratory experiments, which is where all the evidence supposedly is that there's a replication problem, and that the replication rate for stereotype threat effects in a laboratory environment is only around 58.4%. Okay, and that I think is being generous. 41.6% of the time, the stereotype threat effect doesn't even happen, and this is in their little experiment rooms where the researchers are in total control of the testing environment and are actively trying to produce an effect on a test in which doing poorly won't have any negative real-world consequences. Okay, so that seems to be kind of a big deal. That even in their little worlds where they control the environment, they only produce an effect 58.6% of the time. Or 58.6% of the time. But the second problem with laboratory tests is publication bias, right? So even that number is probably more than what really happens because that's just the published studies, right? And there are two ways to check for publication bias. One is the most straightforward. You find a bunch of unpublished studies and see if the unpublished studies lean more one way than another, and another way of doing it is called a funnel analysis. Of course, the problem with seeking out unpublished studies is, of course, they're not published, right? So you have to go out and find them. And of the 9 unpublished studies that found by Wichertz and Ganley, 2 of them showed a stereotype threat effect, 7 showed no effect. So that's a sign that the unpublished stereotype threat studies, however many there are out there for real, because we only found 9 of them, that they probably show more negative results than the published studies do, like a lot more. Now, a funnel analysis, it's a little bit complicated. But basically, a funnel analysis looks at the variation within each studies of a given effect, in this case a stereotype threat effect, and based on how much noise there is within the studies, how much, what the standard deviation is in terms of the effect size of stereotype threat, we can estimate how many studies we would expect to show a negative result, right? I.e., there's a bunch of noise in the results of stereotype threat, okay? And so we would expect just, by chance, if you do enough studies, eventually you're going to get some studies that show a negative result, right? Just by chance, right? Even if there is an overall positive effect out there in the real world, you would expect, if you do 100 studies, some of them are going to come up negative, even if, 80 of them come up positive, right? because there's just noise in the world. And so we would expect by chance to have some studies with a negative finding. And what Wichard's found is that basically there aren't enough negative results given the variation in the data. I.e., the amount of noise that exists with the published studies, there should be more negatives. Okay? And what this is a sign, and so when this is what's found in a funnel analysis, this is said to be a sign that the negative results aren't being published, and that's a sign that there's publication bias going on. Okay, and the last problem, the fifth problem with stereotype threat, is that the predictive validity is basically the same for all races, which is to say, your SAT score predicts college performance about the same for blacks, whites, and Hispanics. Now, you could say that, like, sure, that's because stereotype threat doesn't just apply to these tests. It applies to all academic work. That is, stereotype threat comprehensively permeates all of academia. It cannot be escaped. Okay? And, and if your view is that comprehensive, I mean, we're having a different discussion at that point. And obviously, something like that requires a lot more evidence. And it would be, and if you just assert it, that would be something that's pretty hard to, to falsify. I think you're getting close to sort of an unfalsifiable proposition when you can say, yes, there's stereotype threat, but you cannot detect it very well because it permeates everything. It's literally everywhere. And so, the only way you would be able to notice stereotype threat if there's variation in stereotype threat, but it's always present, and so you're not going to detect much variation, and so it may seem that it's not there at all when really it's there all the time, right? This sort of, these sort of things. Obviously, that's not what Jeff Holiday is saying. At least I don't think, but. I think that's sort of the only out you could really have for the fact that, these standardized tests basically predict the same for all racial groups. And so if certain racial groups are systematically underperforming on the SAT, why then aren't they overperforming once they get to college? So that's a problem with that. So there's a lot of problems with stereotype threat, and even I'm gonna have to go out and actually go find and collect the statements on this, but for now I'll just sort of say even people who do a lot of research on stereotype threat aren't nearly as bullish on the conclusions of stereotype threat researchers as like sociologists are. Like the actual people who do stereotype threat research don't generalize it onto like the real world to nearly the same degree as the people who don't do stereotype threat research. The people who think stereotype threat research is a really big deal are like the English lit people and like the in like sociology majors, not the actual intelligence researchers that are actually doing these studies. The people actually doing these studies are far more aware of the limitations of the studies and far less bullish about extrapolating it onto everything else. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is, I'll call it politics. And these are a few things that Jeff Holiday said that I think weren't considered very carefully and were more likely instant reactions than thought out statements or ideas. The first thing I want to talk about is he said that Molyneux's views on race are colored by what is essentially a white nationalist outlook. He didn't use the term white nationalist, I don't think. Maybe he did, I don't know. But that's basically, at this point, that's what Stefan Molyneux kind of is. And maybe that's true. Maybe Molyneux's politics at this point are sort of coloring his views on the science of human biodiversity, we'll call it. But remember, Molyneux used to hold radical environmentalist views on every aspect of psychology. Okay, he like the peaceful parenting, like I suspect that Molyneux actually doesn't believe this anymore, but Molyneux at one point, like, his whole shtick was peaceful parenting, and that he basically believed that all parents, like, not like maybe a very small fraction were not, but he basically believed that basically all parents were bad, and that this was creating statists, and that if you could improve parenting properly, that you could have peaceful parenting, you would create, you know, rational thinkers who would not be statists. Okay, and I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, he never used this term, the new libertarian man, just as Marx never used the term the new socialist man, but that's basically what Molyneux was pushing for years, and it was the starting imprimatur for free domain radio. Okay, and it wasn't, and he didn't say this right away, but eventually he got to a certain podcast. If you go through his podcast, he got to a point where he said that he basically founded free domain radio to promote peaceful parenting, because this peaceful parenting is what would create the new libertarian man. He never used the term new libertarian man. That's a term I'm using to describe sort of, you know, pithily what he was saying. Okay, so he didn't start off as like a big genetics guy, to say the least. Okay, he held a radical environmentalist view on every aspect of psychology, and in his podcast, like, he never really talked about race until, okay, let me put it this way: Stefan Molyneux never really talked about race until he started talking about race. But back in 2009, when I was on the Free Domain Radio forums, I brought up race realism, and I was banned very fast. I think it was less than a day. I was banned permanently, even though I was a donor to the site, to my shame. And I wasn't even pushing white nationalism. I was just talking about race and IQ. Okay, so you, Jeff Holiday, I mean, it seems to me like you wouldn't ban people for talking about, you know, sort of like Charles Murray style bell curve, you know, race and IQ stuff. Okay, that's kind of what I was talking about on the forums. I wasn't even talking about, you know, white nationalism, right? I was not nearly as radical then as I am now on this stuff. So, but I was still banned. So in that sense, Molyneux was a much more of kind of a radical environmentalist than I suspect you are, Jeff Holiday. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're like kind of a Marxoid in terms of like an environmental blank slate determinist, kind of like Molyneux was. I mean, it wasn't a Marxoid; it was more of a like libertarianoid blank slater. And in addition, like, and even if you didn't know that, you know, Molyneux started Free Domain Radio with a very strong influence from Ayn Rand, who, I mean, if you know much about Ayn Rand, was very seriously against any kind of racial thinking. Now, perhaps she wasn't she was against like racialism as a form of collective identity, and she probably wasn't against it in the way that you would like, right? But nonetheless, objectivists imagine themselves to be very hardcore, very strident anti-racists, quote unquote, anti-racist. But what happened with Molyneux on this is what happened with me. Okay, race realism comes first. Okay. And that informs the political views. Okay, race realism comes first. The political views come later. Okay. Of course, then the political views probably go back and then influence and create some sort of bias, right? And there's sort of this circular thing. And you know, I kind of like to imagine that I'm free from this effect, but I'm probably not. Whatever. Now, there are a subset of people for whom white nationalism comes first, and then later, if ever, they'll read about race realism. And these people are what I call the blood in the face types. And I call them that after a documentary called Blood in the Face, which I would recommend watching. Now, if you watch the documentary Blood in the Face, you may be excused for thinking that the cameramen just went out of the way, tried to find like the craziest bubbas that they could find, and only record sort of the craziest stuff that they heard. But in my personal experience, what is in that documentary is not dishonest or cherry picked. That's basically them. That's basically an accurate portrayal of what these kinds of people are like. Okay, you know, it may be okay. It may be a little bit cherry picked in the sense of like they're going to show the most interesting things. They're going to show the things that cause the most reaction to the viewer. You know, for example, they're not going to like record a conversation between two Nazis where they spend 90% of the time talking about, you know, like their box turtles or something. You know, they're gonna have clips of them when they're talking about, you know, Nazi stuff, right? And for those, that's basically accurate and not cherry picked. But anyway, but those people, those sort of blood in the face people for whom white nationalism came first and race realism came later, if ever, okay, those people have always existed, and there's perhaps 500,000 of them, and their numbers don't really change, but like that's not, like, you know, like, come on, like, you know that's not Molyneux. You know that's not Molyneux. Another thing that's kind of weird that you said is that one ought to risk their lives for their fellow Americans. Now, you wouldn't say, at least I don't think, I'm sort of putting words in your mouth there. You wouldn't say that we have some obligation to risk our lives for people in like a civil war in Angola, for example. But we do have an obligation for this thing you call Americans. But of course, Molyneux, and I'll be blunt, I don't believe in either America or Americans. There is no American race, obviously. There's no American religion. There's no American view of government. There's no American view of economics or of the right to free speech. Okay? People say, well, I support free speech, but not hate speech. Hate speech, you know, reduces free speech. You know, like they'll say things like that. And there's the Constitution, but there's no uniformly American conception of what this Constitution means. There is no American view of family, of career, of business, or the degree to which institutions should work together in sort of a communal manner, that law and businesses should work together to get everybody employed, or if they should all act sort of independently. American literally means nothing. And it's what happens when you let anybody become an American. Right? When there's no filters on either what they have to believe to become an American, right, or what they have to be genetically to become an American, right? And you can say that, well, good. There should definitely be no limitations on what they should be genetically to become an American. Okay, fine. I mean, you can say that that's good. That there should not be those kinds of limits. Okay, but like, let me put it this way: if you're against nationalism, fine. Like if you say that it's good that there's no religious limit on what is an American. It's good that there's no, or maybe I could use a more pejorative term. It's good that there's no religious standards for an American, or that there's no ideological, in terms of views of government, standards for being an American. And there's no standards for how, you know, that's one way to put it. And now you can say that it's good to not have those standards, or you can call them limitations, depending on how you see it. And you can support them and say, okay, but don't expect anybody to get excited about going to war over this, what is now a no man's land that you call America. I mean, there's a United States federal government, and there's states government, and there's county governments. I'm not like saying, you know, it doesn't exist. Obviously, there is something there, but like America, what does America mean other than this government? It's a political entity at this point, nothing more. And you're shocked when someone says that, one, that they wouldn't lift a finger but more importantly, tells others not to go off and die in some pointless war for people that would have you thrown in a re-education camp. Okay? Now, I presume, Jeff Holiday, that you're an atheist. So how would you react to someone saying that they want to fight and die for fellow Christians, even though those fellow Christians don't think of themselves as Christians and think Christianity is false and evil and that Christians should be dealt with severely? Okay? That's how I feel about America, right? It's hollow, vapid, empty air, okay? It's wind howling through nothing, okay? It's strange people eating invisible food and then wondering why they're so hungry, okay? That's America. And your reaction to white identity is something that I actually didn't expect from you, okay? Because, let me put it this way. You know that white identity is historically normal, that it's the default. Now, it's not something that you really think of, but I think, like, you know, if you sort of sit back and close your eyes and think for like a minute, you go, oh yeah, like basically, you know, Britain was a white nationalist country, you know, like, or Canada, like their immigration policy was white only, you know, and they had some policies to keep the races separate from each other. I mean, yeah, obviously that, like, they, you know, that's, if you think about it for a few seconds, it's really obvious that white nationalism is the historical norm. Okay, it's the default, and it took a ton of, what should we call it, conditioning, or, you know, education and enlightenment, if you wish. Right? On one side you could call it conditioning, on the other side you could call it enlightenment. To get white people to stop being white nationalists. Okay, and this starts today. This starts at the age of 5 with, you know, sessions on black and only black slavery, or you may want to call it lessons on slavery. Now, imagine if you had a massive program to stamp out, like, objectivism, right, starting from age 5 going to adulthood. And yet, despite all your efforts, you would still have people, right, especially like when they're drunk or tired or in their unguarded moments, they would say things like, altruism is a spook and, you know, selfishness is a virtue. It would go on about the glorious truth of atomic individualism, okay? And say you had not anti-racist or anti-fascist, I'm against fascists. All right, and you wouldn't have anti-fascist action. You had anti-objectivist action. Right, all those punks fighting, quote unquote, against the system. Right, basically going around marching, stamping out the minority of people who express objectivist sentiments, and they would say, bash the Rand, etc., etc. Of course, that's a joke, right? And that seems kind of funny, but that's what's happening with white identity. It requires constant environmental pressure to suppress racial sentiment, right? And what you call, and you call that progress, I call it a cage. And this is why it's stupid for people to say things like, you know, white identity is never coming back. Look at how demonized it is. But that's like... that's treating white identity like it's some, like, political ideology, like objectivism, like libertarianism, you know, or like a religion, okay, or some other synthetic belief system, when it's not. It's not something that you like. Nobody has to be taught white identity. It's just there, okay. Even in you, Jeff Holiday, it's in you. Now, if a religion or political ideology were as demonized as white identity, yes, it would have no hope of coming back. I mean, if objectivism was as comprehensively, you know, conditioned against, starting at age 5 with you know, telling kindergartners who have no critical reasoning abilities, have no way to put anything into context. If you went to them at age 5 and told them, here's what some objectivists did in the past, here's how bad they were, you know, they would then go, oh, Okay. You know, obviously, there would be no objectivism, right? And if people who expressed objectivist sentiments were like shouted down or like, you know, like it wouldn't exist, okay? But all that is done to white identity, and yet it is the current year. It is 2016, and here it is. You know, it's funny. I saw like an interview on like some stupid like alphabet soup news, CNN, NBC, ABC, whatever, some dumb news channel, and there's some guy who was interviewing a Ku Klux Klan member, and and one thing he was saying, I can't believe in this year, the year 1984. This year, it's 1984, and we're still talking about race. You know, I thought that was kind of funny because it was like, yeah, you know, every year, it's the current year. Think about that. Okay, so like each generation has to be trained in being not racist, but if this training either doesn't happen in someone, or like they somehow like they reject their training, okay, well, what do you expect's going to happen, Jeff Holiday? I mean, like like this isn't a trick question. It should be really obvious what's going to happen if they're either not trained in anti-racism, or, you know, and he used anti-racism kind of ironically, right? And maybe if we have a discussion, I can tell you why I think it's sort of an ironic statement. But like, yeah, like it's super obvious. They'll become what you call racist, right? They'll become what Britain was in 1900, right? They'll become what Canada was, what Australia was in the year 1900, right? They will become white nationalist, white separatist, the terms that we have today for that. But of course, back then they didn't have those terms, okay? Because it wasn't, how do I put it? They're not gonna, like, you don't have terms for things that are like, you wouldn't call yourself a breathingist. I support the philosophy of breathing in oxygen. Like there's no term for that because it's just what everything is, okay? Kind of like with white nationalism. Like white nationalism didn't become a term until it became distinct from something, what? Something other than white nationalism? How weird, okay? And similarly, you could talk about how here's another example of that happening. The family, right? People, you start to get people, like for most of history, everyone was a supporter of the man, woman, nuclear family. But over time, as people start to support alternative lifestyles, is the word they use. You then have people who advocate for just a man and a woman, traditional family. They then become, quote unquote, advocates of traditional families. But of course, back, in the 1950s, there was no such thing as a advocate of a traditional family because that's just what everyone was. You didn't call it anything because that's just what everyone was. And like in the year 1900, right? How do I put it? I'm just going to say something that may sound sort of weird, but I think you'll understand what I'm saying. Back in the year 1900, there were no white nationalists because everyone was a white nationalist. You see how this works? Now, so, like, that's what's going to happen. So when you have someone like Stefan Molyneux, for whom, deconstructing the spirits of the age isn't some hobby horse, but is his life's focus, however misguided you may think he is, of course, he's going to blow off that lid of racial conditioning or enlightenment. He's going to reject the Enlightenment, I guess, and he's going to come to his own conclusions. And when white people come to their own conclusions on race, well, what have those always been in the past? White nationalism, okay? And that's why your reaction to this is so surprising to me because, like, what else would you expect? Sure, call it irrational, illogical, immoral, primitive, retrograde, undoing of centuries of progress. Sure, that's certainly what you believe. Okay, but for goodness sake, don't act surprised. And moreover, thanks to the internet, race realist arguments are getting more traction than ever before. More and more people are becoming kind of anti-authoritarian in their views of knowledge. And anti-racism, quite frankly, like quote-unquote anti-racism, it's sustained by a mixture of social shaming and this sort of top-down morality. And also, this kind of ties into the fact that people who identify as politically liberal are actually more sensitive to social shaming, which is, I don't want to digress into that, so this is what usually happens to people who stop putting any effort into being not racist. Okay, when people stop trying to be, people stop that effort, they stop fighting that battle. Okay, and so it's why I say to a lot of people, and I'll say to you, that white nationalism may seem like it's a million miles away, but it's really like crossing the street. Okay, you may despise it, but it's right there and it's very close. Okay, not only is it very close in terms of like it's a sentiment that exists in spite of constant suppression, but it's also closer intellectually than you may be comfortable to admit. If you drop some of this philosophical baggage, right, and start looking at the efforts of multiracialism honestly, stop assuming, like this sort of just fiat proclamation that it's your responsibility to care about everyone on the planet. And don't just assume that a successful multiracial state is like the goal. The goal is to have black people and white people in the same country getting along swimmingly. That is the goal. And you may ask why. If they don't like each other, why don't they just go separate ways? That seems pretty obvious. That's what you do with like individual people. Why not with groups that on aggregate don't get along? It's like, well, because I don't know, like some communist preacher. Yes, I'm referring to Martin Luther King. Some communist preacher, like, said some things about the races getting along. Therefore, like, there's no logic to any of this. It's weird. But as soon as you drop that stuff, right, and then you honestly try to understand this race realism thing, okay, what would happen if you do this? I'm not saying that you'll do this. You probably won't, because most people don't. You will find yourself becoming a white nationalist. It won't be a conscious decision on your part. And it'll be like becoming an anti-SJW, right? It's just an accumulation of a bunch of stuff, and then one day, there you are. You may not even notice it as it happens because it may come so slowly, or, it may happen overnight. It didn't happen overnight for Molyneux, but it was pretty close, okay? And it can happen overnight. I've seen it happen overnight, but normally it doesn't. Anyway, and also, just one last thing to say in this. Obviously, Molyneux doesn't think that women are different subspecies. He doesn't think that people who have different politics are different subspecies. I know what he said in a stream of consciousness sort of word salad video. Like, okay, but please, like, he doesn't think that. I know that you know that I know that that he doesn't think that. So, like, just, like, don't push that, please. Don't be like the political press where you like take like these quotes and say, aha, clearly he believes. Like, for example, it would be sort of like when Donald Trump said that Hillary had spent her whole life fighting ISIS, and then you took that quote and said, aha, Trump thinks that Hillary spent her whole life fighting ISIS. Why are you faulting me for saying that? Trump said that. Like, it's okay. It's, yeah, just don't do that. It drags this discourse down to kind of a low place that you don't want to go.